the FCC issued two fairness reports, that they call them. One was in 1974, in which it explained for the public, for everybody to know, how it administered the fairness doctrine. For example, it pointed out that it didn't monitor the airwaves, it didn't watch the programs on television or listen to the programs on radio and see, oh, are they complying with the fairness doctrine? They didn't do any such thing. It was completely a complaint-activated regulation. That is, they would look at what was said or not said on the air only in response to a complaint. They didn't get all that many. And the overwhelming majority of the complaints were received by the FCC in Washington and dropped into the file and disappeared forever. Only a very few of them were read by somebody at the FCC and then sent to the licensee in Seattle or Omaha or wherever they were and said, look, we've got this complaint about your violation of the fairness doctrine. What do you got to say about it? And the licensee would get the company lawyer to write a letter back to the FCC saying, well, no, we covered that issue, and we covered it with contrasting views. One was on Sunday morning, one was on Tuesday afternoon, but it all sort of balanced out. And that would go back to the FCC, which would put it in the file, and that was the end of it. It was extremely rare when the FCC actually sanctioned a licensee, as it did in the Fred Cook case. The emphasis, the fairness report said, was on the licensee's overall programming. That is, each newscast, each documentary, each program did not have to be fair and, what is it that Fox says? Fair and balanced. You could have one sharp point of view in one program, and a week later, or a month later, have the opposing view on, and that would satisfy the FCC. That was 1974. 1985, the Commission issued a second fairness report, which sounded like it came from a different planet. It emphasized the multiplicity of voices available in various media, that there were 48% more radio outlets in 85 than there were at the time of Red Lion in 69. Lots more television. Cable was on the scene. There were niche periodicals, magazines of all kinds, and concluded that enforcing the fairness doctrine was unnecessary to provide a diversity of views in any community. And went beyond that to say that the government's regulation of licensees by the fairness doctrine had a chilling effect, like the licensees had argued back in Red Lion, that it actually inhibited the presentation of controversial views. And so the Commission in 1987 voted to abandon the fairness doctrine, not to enforce it at all. And it hasn't been enforced since 1987. What happened between 1974 and 1985 that would account for that flip-flop in the Commission's views on the fairness doctrine? Media outlets, certainly, I mean, that's what they acknowledged, but who were the decision makers? The commissioners, of course, were entirely different people than in the 1974 report. And the FCC commissioners in 1985 were appointees of President Ronald Reagan, who came into office on a platform strongly emphasizing get government off the backs of business. It was a platform of let's eliminate or at least reduce government regulation of business. And government regulation of broadcast was one of the points in that agenda. So the commission finally ended up dumping the fairness doctrine. Periodically, over the years since 1987, there have been attempts to resurrect the fairness doctrine and reimpose it on broadcasters. A couple of times it has passed Congress, with the Democratic Congress, only to be vetoed by Republican presidents. The doctrine has created strange bedfellows. Supporting the fairness doctrine are by and large Democrats, Ralph Nader and the consumer movement, the environmentalists, the ACLU favored the fairness doctrine. Ben Bagdikian, the former dean of the journalism school here, told me once that he thought the fairness doctrine was a good idea as long as it's not too strictly enforced. But then opposing the fairness doctrine, you have Reagan and the business community, National Association of Broadcasters, no surprise there. William O. Douglas, Justice Douglas, First Amendment absolutist, thought it was ridiculous that the government could regulate the speech of broadcasters. And Governor Cuomo, the first Governor Cuomo of New York, Mario Cuomo, a noted liberal, wrote an op-ed piece calling it the unfairness doctrine and was completely opposed to it. Nowadays, when there are rumors that somebody might try to reenact the fairness doctrine, the most vociferous opponents are the right-wing talk radio people, the Rush Limbaughs of the world, the Christian right stations around the country, who have no pretense of presenting a fair and balanced menu to the listeners. It's all one-sided on all issues, and they call it the silence Christian and conservative broadcasters law instead of the fairness doctrine. So it's not that it doesn't seem to get any traction at all. The commission didn't, oddly, deal with the personal attack and political editorial rules when it abolished the general fairness doctrine, and it dithered for quite a long time, and then was ordered in 1990, wasn't it? No, 2000, to quit enforcing those rules. So the whole thing is gone now. But it could still be reimposed if there were a political will to do that, because Red Lion is still good law. Red Lion has been questioned often and recently, but it has never been overruled, and it's still the law that Congress may regulate the broadcast medium, including its content. So then let's compare broadcast with print, and that's the Miami Herald case from just 5 years after Red Lion. Oh, dear. Help! Okay. Is it glad? Okay, thanks. And Miami Herald involved a state law from Florida that was very much like the personal attack rule that the FCC had done. It was a state law that gave political candidates the right to reply to an attack in a newspaper, to criticism and attacks on his record. And the politician, the candidate, was Pat Tornillo, that's how he pronounced it, who was running for the Florida House of Representatives. And the Miami Herald published an editorial that was critical of him and his candidacy. And he demanded that the newspaper print his response, which they were required to do under the Florida statute, a right of reply statute, that said that if a candidate for election is assailed regarding his personal character or official record by any newspaper, then the candidate would be entitled to reply in as conspicuous a place as the original attack, and so on. And at the time of Miami Herald, 1974, there was a movement afoot in the country to get access for the unempowered portions of our citizenry to the media. Their views were being ignored, and they wanted to be heard, and the contention was that the government should require the news media to open up and deliver views representative of the community, along the same lines as the thinking in Red Lion. But the case went to the Supreme Court, and an opinion by Chief Justice Berger, he spends a good while laying out the argument of the right to reply folks eloquently, really, in a persuasive way, saying that they vigorously argue that the government has an obligation to ensure that a wide variety of views reach the public. Go back into the history that at the time the First Amendment was written, there were newspapers for every segment of the populace. All views were represented in newspapers. The press was broadly representative of the people. Entry into publishing was easy, inexpensive. There was a true marketplace of ideas. That was then. Now, the news media is big business, run by big corporations. There are far fewer of them than there were at the time of the Constitution. There are so many one newspaper towns, and there are lots of towns where the owner of the newspaper also owns a television station or a radio station, or both, that the news media are enormously powerful, influential. This concentration of ownership, that's something that you learn about in media studies, right? I mean, it's one of the obvious facts of our media in this country, and in most countries indeed. But what you end up with, according to the right of reply folks, is a homogeneity of editorial opinion, and the public has lost any ability to respond or to contribute in any meaningful way to the debate on issues. Entry into this marketplace of ideas is almost impossible. Don't these news media who are in this powerful position have a fiduciary duty to the community? Shouldn't they be accountable in some way to the community if they wield all of this power in our society? But they don't, and they aren't, and this marketplace of ideas is today a monopoly controlled by the owners of the market. Well, that sounds like there ought to be a right of reply. But Chief Justice Berger goes on in his opinion, why are we back to that? Goes on in his opinion to strike down the Florida law as unconstitutional, as a violation of the First Amendment. Prefaces the ruling by saying, a responsible press is an undoubtedly desirable goal, but press responsibility is not mandated by the Constitution, and like many other virtues, it cannot be legislated. That's right. Maybe the most eloquent thing that Berger ever said. My version of it is that a press that the government requires to be fair is not free. Anyway, he strikes down the law, the court strikes down the law, basically for two reasons. That is, first, the Florida law exacts a penalty based on the content of the newspaper. That is, if the content includes an attack on a political candidate, the newspaper is penalized by having to give the candidate space in the newspaper to reply. And that space is valuable. The newspaper could sell ads in that space. That's their inventory. It's the equivalent of airtime for a broadcaster. Could sell ads or could fill it with editorial content. But it has instead, under the Florida law, to give it for free to the political candidate. And faced with these penalties, editors might well conclude that the safe course is to avoid controversy, i.e., here's the chilling effect again. Don't attack political candidates, because if you do, you're going to get penalized. That's one reason. The second reason that the court elaborates in one almost throwaway paragraph, says that even if a newspaper wouldn't face any additional costs, it's unconstitutional because of its intrusion into the function of editors. That a newspaper is not just a passive receptacle of data, conduit for information. The choice of material to go in the newspaper, whether fair or unfair, is an exercise of editorial control and judgment, and it's yet to be demonstrated how governmental regulation of this crucial process can be exercised consistent with First Amendment guarantees of a free press. Intrudes into the function of editors, and that violates freedom of the press. This, as I said the other day, is, I think, the closest the court has ever come to reliance on the press clause of the First Amendment in deciding a case. Berger, right at the top, the beginning sentence, says that the issue is whether this Florida law violates the guarantees of a free press. He doesn't say the First Amendment. He doesn't say the freedoms of speech in the press. He says a free press. And then the concluding of the sentence of the decision also comes back to the rights of a free press. Almost a press clause case, but not relying explicitly on the press clause as the basis for a decision. Justice White concurs, I sent a little reluctantly because he was no big fan of the news media, concurs that on the reasoning that a newspaper or a magazine is not a public utility, subject to reasonable government regulation and so on. That is, it's not like a telephone company that has to carry everybody's speech. And the choice of what goes in the newspaper is one that, under our Constitution, is confided to the editors, not to the government. So what you have is Red Lion in 1969 saying the government can regulate the content of broadcast, and 5 years later in Miami Herald saying the government cannot regulate the content of newspapers. And the Miami Herald decision never even cited, mentioned, attempted to distinguish Red Lion, as though they're not even related in any way. How can you reconcile those two decisions? Say they're both right. Red Lion is a correct decision. Tornillo is a correct decision. Are they compatible? Can they live happily ever after in the same jurisprudential universe? Are they both right? Maybe you say they're both wrong. What do you think? Nothing. Okay. We'll go on to more on broadcast. Oh, yes. It's Katie. It's Katie, right? Yeah.
You said FCC abandoned the fairness doctrine in 1987, so Red Line isn't correct anymore?
No, I said that the FCC abandoned the fairness doctrine in 1987, but Red Lion is still good law. It has never been overruled, and therefore the Commission could, or the Congress could require the Commission to reimpose the fairness doctrine, and under Red Lion that would be permissible, unless the Court is now prepared to overrule Red Lion. And there's some rumblings of that which we'll reach. Yeah?
I think that you can hold them both as legitimate because when somebody reads a newspaper, it's a very different experience than, say, listening to radio or watching television. And the editorial process, as well as people who contribute, is different, and the amount of people who read this is different. I would say that you could argue that newspapers are much more individualized, right? I mean, there's like 4 newspapers for Bertha and Anna Daily Cow, and that's student-based issues and all these things. So therefore, I think people reconcile that because they're quite different in what they do and who they speak to.
Well, certainly the experience of reading a newspaper is different from the experience of listening to radio or television, to such a degree and to such an extent that government regulation of the content is permitted in one and not of the other. Because with newspapers you can find this crossword puzzle or the funnies.
I think it would be hard. Like, let's talk about like the letters to the editor or the op-ed section. If you had to have countering LTEs for letters to the editor, I mean, you have to have somebody like writing them in the office. It might be hard to find ones of substance that could counter and do justice to the other side of them.
Nick?
Well, I mean, a newspaper is also a private company who pay to read this news, so to regulate
You don't pay to read the Daily Cow, do you? Well, maybe you do, but there are lots of free newspapers around.
Okay. I guess that was where I was going. Is that you can really call it a scarce resource and private. So for the government to say to get in the way of what editors think is newsworthy is maybe an overreach, whereas public broadcasting is free for everybody. Its intent is to be free for everybody, so it should present both.
Julia?
Could the government's thought process have been that because broadcasting is like a fleeting resource that they do need to show both sides because like newspapers aren't, therefore it's up to their expression?
The broadcasters are using a free resource, you say?
Well, it's fleeting, so like it's scarce.
Oh, scarce.
Yeah, so therefore they do have to like show both sides because it is so much hit.
Yeah, well, but we only have so many trees, and well, but on a practical level, you can't just decide, well, I'm going to start a newspaper this week and get my view out there. It's a difficult barrier to entry in both situations. Lindsay?
Could it be the amount of time that it takes for a newspaper for someone to write a rebuttal against an attack that was said about them? It takes a lot more time and it's a lot of a lengthier process, whereas if you say it on the radio, you can have an open exchange of ideas, and it takes less time to get through the issue, rather than like a newspaper, because you can tend to go back and forth between attacks by candidates, and if you keep disagreeing with what they keep saying, then you're required by law to keep giving them space to rebuttal your attack.
Yeah. It doesn't really take, I don't think it takes longer to reply radio and television as opposed to newspaper. Both of them, I think they were required to do something within a week. And it doesn't, how long does it take to write a little 2-paragraph rebuttal by the politician's campaign and so on? Ruby?
I guess the difference is that Reliant is for the government set up the infrastructure for broadcasters to have that frequency, versus print, like the government's not licensing the newspaper. So the government set up the infrastructure for broadcasters to broadcast, like they can regulate that.
That's certainly an important factor that Red Lion relied on. But isn't it a little circular? I mean, the government is allowed to regulate because government has regulated, whereas with newspapers they're not allowed to regulate because they haven't regulated.
What could they set up the infrastructure for? I guess more like a public good.
Uh-huh.
I don't know.
So yeah.
Well, I think that Red Line also decided in 1969, which was a different chapter, that they, according to standards, the FDA and technology went out, it's not the law anymore, because we have different outlets, we have more ways to get information, not just media, but also social media, for example. So they're very different outlets. There's going to be a fairness doctrine in the sense that they're already the outlets to help satisfy those fairness standards that don't be imposed by government.
Well, that's the view of Chief Judge Kaczynski. Remember, those of you who listened to the audio of the in-bank argument in Minority TV, he's saying Red Lion and that spectrum scarcity thing, that's horse and buggy days. And our situation has been transformed by new technology now. Fine, but it's not, I don't think, the proper business of the Court of Appeals to say Red Lion's no longer good.